Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Having failed to split you up very effectively, I've now failed to bring you back together very effectively. But hopefully we can make the last 20 minutes entertaining anyway, if nothing else. I realised as soon as I said for love or money that the groups who had to talk about that would come back and say both. So you don't get any points for saying both. You've got to say both plus something else. Okay, where's the first rapporteur of the group one?
What we said after what we've been hearing for the past hour, I mean, it's like much more complicated than just love or money, because yeah, surprise, surprise, because I mean, because we've been hearing about how things that that you do for the love of it are now being that the people are making money off it in ways that we didn't think would happen, So I think that's how we started, and then we started talking about situations where people deliberately decided to not be paid. And I think so. Stephen was giving the example of people who write fan fiction, and someone who decided to deliberately sort of not take money, even though this person knows that I think this person is like sort of screenwriting and that kind of thing.
The Hollywood writers.
Yeah.
Who interact with their fan fiction pages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Constance gave an example of. Trying to think it was like some students at Cal Arts who found a way to get people's artworks onto the set of Melrose Place, and they could potentially be sued by Fox, I think, but it was also it was really important for them not to actually take any money from it. So we talked about those examples, and then we also talked about how this whole question of commercialization doesn't always operate the same in other places. When we talk about commercialization, we make the assumption that there was this sort of prior situation of state support that's now being taken away, but there's some situations, like you're saying in India, where that state support never existed, and so this question of commercialization means something really different. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then we started talking about like the sort of oversupply situation, and then does this lead to a push towards credentialization, and then we started talking about the PhD in arts and how there's more and more of this, and the whole question around what is the function of art school, and why do people want to do something like a PhD or even MFA? Is it because people want it? Because do people do PhDs because it'll give them an edge over all the other people with MFAs to get teaching work? I mean, is it a question of does it work as a kind of does it provide the same function that grants used to, and even if people can get funding to do it, but it's also this whole question of sort of what is credentialization in response to situation oversupply. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Yes, as expected, also our discussion kind of veered off in different directions. In taking my notes, I've tried to identify three sort of main pathways. That of value, then. How do we attribute value to work labor? Is there sort of a position between pleasure or feel-good value towards monetary gain in the sense of for love or money, the traditional paradigm? In this sense, also the other value, possible effects or cultural effects of the work produced outside of monetary gains. Also, the point of the ways in which artists or full-time artists, basically meaning people who actually live off their art, in the ways in which they need to sort of commercialize themselves and make themselves marketable within an increasingly sort of cultural sphere of where what actually counts is monetary gain, as opposed to perhaps the person who produces cultural goods or creative goods in their leisure time, where monetary gain is not essential to sustenance. Then this sort of went into the problem of definitions, and we've all felt there's this problem of defining what constitutes the creative industries. We've all felt that there's sort of this amorphous sort of boundaries between what is creative, what is cultural material, what is effective labor. In a sense, also pondering about the very definition of labor. How do we define labor? Labor is basically monetary-driven activity, an activity in which we derive monetary gain, or is it all types of labor, all types of work where we put actually time and effort into producing or processing something? In this sense, do we also encompass an idea of creative work, the housewife or the housekeeper, the person that cooks for the family, the person who storytells, the person who drives the kids to work, to school, et cetera, and also the sort of activities or the so-called folk activities who do have a negative connotations, but are also ingrained in sort of traditions of family and reproductions as well. very much in the idea of categories, then we go into the difference between process and product. Do we look at creative factors within the process of producing a cultural good or service, or do we look at the end product? And in that sense, what do we actually think about the performance of creating that product, or actually the end product? How do we measure the creative impact? Also, we took a look at what differentiates the sort of uneasy sort of drawing distinction between the creative industry being in the post-industrial age as opposed to the industrial age, where there's sort of homogeneous labor producing a homogeneous good as opposed to the post-industrial age where there is apparently sort of a creative influx. And last but not least, the idea of whatever constitutes creative industries is whatever one pours in time, feels a sense of belonging, identity, and ownership within that process or product. And finally, the sort of distinction between what is commercial, deriving commercial good, or sort of less discrete factors such as communal goods, and very much tying into the idea of what constitutes this sort of creative, immaterial, or affective labor, opposed to a strict sense of creative industries.
Have we got a self-organizing group 3? By any chance?
This group whose theme is self-organization didn't self-organize.
I cursed you.
It broke that into anarchy. No one wants to report, and they want me to. But I'm going to ask you to say what you said.
I'll start with this. Okay.
Come on, boys, don't fight.
Just give me the countdown.
What is very interesting about this session is that it's introducing vocabulary into humanities, let's say, humanities discussion of creative industries, cultural industries, whatever you want to call it, loosely construed, about labor, about unions, terminology which may not be familiar to those of you who are trained in the humanities, questions of service unions versus movement unions, what they do differently in relation to the local problems, bread and butter versus long-range goals of organizing, how they see solidarity. All of these things become new in some ways if you want to embrace the idea of the creative industries, and it's an important feature or dimension of what you might call the role of the humanities in the creative industries. It means homework. It means embedding new ideas and perspectives into the approach to what you do in making culture, making literature, making media in some ways. You have to think about the established organizations, labor organizations, et cetera, and those where they don't exist, and why don't they exist. So we talked about that. George?
That's my part. I talked about the disorganized organization. What that led to was a reflection on what happens to those new forms of activity or labor that have not traditionally been organized. For example, the people who are going to be feeding reality shows, or artists. Artists have had certain kinds of organizations, artist organizations, that can provide services like health insurance, and other such kinds of, but they do not have collective bargaining because they do not have the same connection to corporations, let's say film production companies, so on and so forth, that, as in that case. So there's a collective bargaining element missing to that kind of labor. The issue came up, and you raised it, and it didn't get grounded well enough in our discussion, and maybe somebody else has some ideas about it, had to do with the solidarity element that synonymously was called affection, caring, and what have you, which seemed to be also an important concept for either particular kinds of industries. We're talking about startups, and the kind of ethos that might function within those, and then the questioning of such terms for cross-class organization. All right, the idea that something like caring, affection, or solidarity can carry to cross-class organization. Then another question came up about precarity, or at least the one element that I could do. In what way has there been a concrete example of cross-class solidarity in a precarity movement? At least in the case of the intermittents in France, it was clear that that the performing arts, the idea of intermittency in contracts for intermittents is that if for a certain minimum of performances a year, let's say 50 or 60, I forget the exact number, you have an annual wage. What it recognizes is that you have done a lot of labor around the particular performances that has to be recognized. And the intermittents were able to get a contract, which was then put into, what actually was removed by the Sarkozy government. I mean, that's one of the things happens when you get a neoliberal in government. But there was a huge demonstration that was cross-class, cross-sectorial, beyond the performing arts workers, that brought on all different kinds of workers, and then the idea of the recognition that there's a difference between work and employment, and that one has to recognize the kinds of work that one is doing, not just at the moment of employment. What eventually happened is that the French government imposed the idea of unemployment insurance, abrogating the notion of all the work that one does when one is not employed. And so that's a very important struggle that certainly carries over to adjuncts who've basically done the same work that tenured people have done, but who are not recognized for the work that they do when they're not have the same terms of employment. That was those were some of the issues that we discussed.
I'm going to quickly run through our discussion. We could have easily talked about this for another 20 minutes within our group. A big question that kept on hanging over our discussion was the efficacy of the concept of the precariat, and whether or not there were other models or other sorts of international unions that could be effective for helping creative individuals organize. We thought about the freelancers union. That was one of the things that we offered up. Toby came by and offered up the Euro Mayday network and also the concept of the cognitariat. But a big question that kept on coming up was, is it the responsibility to follow capital investment with organization? So with the example of the blogosphere and Web 2.0, how much labor goes into all the volunteers who hang out on those blogs and contribute a huge amount of the creative material that is on those websites, but they're not actually considered part of the people who profit from those websites. Or in social networking sites like Facebook, where your membership contributes to the money that, what's his name? The guy who makes all the money there. Sorry. But it's a question of, when capital starts making profit with our leisure time, does it become our responsibility to organize that? Or is it the responsibility of the person who is doing that leisure to seek out some sort of representation? And some people would say, no, this is my play. And this question of where do we define labor in our current world? This was a big, big question. We kept on circling back to it. We also talked about the former labor of consumption. We had a lot of stuff to talk about. Telecommuting, how does one organize telecommuters? It's one thing to organize in a workplace where you have face-to-face interactions and it's not considered to be encroaching on somebody's personal space, but in their home. Just imagine how somebody would react if you're like, here, let's sign a card, let's unionize, give us your membership. Yeah, but as somebody who's done door-to-door door knocking, it's a little bit more challenging, and I'd be worried about that. And then this other thing came up where a lot of people who are precarious workers, people who are freelancers, make a ton of money. They make gobs and gobs and gobs of money. And, how do we justify spending time organizing them when they would not want to be organized? The example of graphic organizers or computer programmers who do freelance work coding, who spend 60 to 80 hours a week working when they do have work to do, but then they have 6 months off, and they might not be working at all. They might be having fun, and they are living off the spoils of really intense, inhumane work, but they are living off the spoils of it. What do we do about that? And so these are just some of the things that we were coming up with. But the big question was, freelance models, are there models for this? And we didn't have an answer. But the big, that's just sort of where we were.
When he referred to the issue Toby came in and he talked about reality shows and then people wanting to send in their videos and so on and so forth, and what are the arrangements there, the kind of work that also happens on social networking, so on and so forth. And then the question came up, or at least Juan addressed the issue that, well, there's a lot of people who want to ex express their talent. All right, this opens up, and they don't necessarily, in some cases, they want to make money of it. There's the jackpot, but then there's the question, like Alejandro raised, of people who want, for whatever community kinds of collective ethos, to also express themselves communally. So the question that was asked was, is that something that, as in the social networking model, can also be in some way appropriated or monetized or something like that? And there's the whole question of whether NGOs and other kinds of organizations, as in the critiques that Lazzaratto and Negri and Hart make of NGOs, which is that the injunction is express yourself in order to empower yourself, and whether that express yourself to empower yourself is an incorporation into a neoliberal paradigm or not. I will have more to say about that tomorrow, but
we really had about, gosh, 3 or 4 or 5 different discussions, because the way we were aligned, it was interesting. We decided to go outside, and so some of us were down there already talking, then a few of us, 4 of us got there, conversation shifted. Then we decided to come back upstairs because we thought it was time, and then conversation shifted again in the stairwell while we were talking on the way up. Then one final piece, yeah, so let me be quick. The first question we started with, well, yeah, it was kind of intentional. Lisa laid it out for us. Was what does regulation mean when everyone with a video camera this Lisa? Yes, when everybody with a video camera can make porn. That throws into question kind of what role basically regulation can have in this kind of economy, Lisa brought up how the conditions of regulation can end up thwarting creativity, so we were right back there with sort of the Reagan sort of intention behind using a creative economy, or something marketed as a creative economy anyway, to overturn Great Society and New Deal entitlements. And then I put down a beat. Because somebody else came in. Okay, and then our question shifted to what end is government regulation intended to serve? What end can government regulation serve? And I guess I sort of introduced this question, although I didn't define it in this way, until Linda helped, which was getting back to what Alejandro was saying, and it was really interesting to me that the discussion between Alejandro and Andrew about the role of art for art's sake, and sort of this idea of people who are using art as a way of creating community, and that the community can have a different meaning for people who have a particular experience. And this, to me, kind of illustrated the sort of different grammars of suffering that we were talking about, in terms of one is very much rooted in the political economy of Marxism that Andrew was giving to us, and the other I felt was rooted in what Alejandro was describing as a need to preserve a community that has been destroyed by the ravages of basically modernity, and to chart a particular grammar of suffering that otherwise is not able to be heard. Now there was a huge discussion around this. So there was a sense that this was kind of a romanticized notion of art, and that if government were to regulate it or set the terms for it, there's still a buyer. There's still somebody. Art is still being commodified in some way, and it can be abused. There's cultural tourism that is marketed as preserving the authentic culture of a particular region, and it can be abusive and end up victimizing the very people it was ostensibly designed to preserve their culture. Okay. Then Linda brought us back to saying, look, it doesn't have to be one or the other. What we have to get down to is what the function of regulation is. So that shifted to another question. Zeynep brought up how regulation of cultural industries often only kicks in because of volume. In other words, people aren't too concerned about certain art at a particular level because it's not high enough volume, so that adds something to the question. Then in the stairwell, we had, I'm sorry, where did you go? Oh, thank you. Allison, yeah. Allison brought up how what how to put this? What is the role of the sort of the welfare state in protecting artists as workers? She brought up that she was a member of the precariat in Detroit, and that the need to provide income on a local level to artists was not able to happen because Detroit was a deindustrialized community, really had no tax base, and the state was not really devoted to the concerns of artists and cultural workers. Let's see, and Annalyn kind of brought back another question of that we need to be be aware of the implications of regulation. She brought up our artists in cultural workers, I guess, in Puerto Rico who have sided with government regulation because it will protect the small-time artists and cultural workers from the big-time cultural workers, but they also don't want it to, regulation to influence their creative work, kind of like the NEA in dispute in this country. So that was our discussion. Yes.
Everywhere else.
From many different countries and many different field sites for research. So basically, we shifted pretty quickly from the notion of precarious individual creative workers towards basically precarious nations in the semi-periphery, and questions of nations struggling in a more geopolitical or international context to assert themselves through the development of creative industry. So we're looking at semi-peripheral countries like Egypt and Brazil, Karim and myself talking about that, and then newly industrializing countries or reindustrializing countries like South Korea. And then two cities that have experienced a traumatic change and cultural re-identification in the immediate present, Dubai and New Orleans. So we kind of shifted from the questions around individual artists, are they self-exploiting or not in a precarious environment, to kind of high-risk projects by states that are basically mobilizing almost totalitarian or very massive campaigns for cultural re-identification. And how does that expand the debate about precariousness, risk, and agency around the question of artistic production? So to try to summarize all of that, basically we looked at one state, Korea, that is invested in, at least what we were talking about, as Hiju was talking about, two different contrasting cultural strategies. One, kind of this frozen preservationist but extreme, high capital investment in national dances and in shamanistic rituals meant to attract tourism while stabilizing a national identity, but which has been criticized for kind of freezing and detaching kind of different rural and other practices from their contexts and from their communities. And on the other hand, there's been another kind of protectionist move to cull wealth or cull profits from American imported films in order to reinvest in South Korean films, which has succeeded in creating a new domestic film industry. So I guess we wanted to focus in that case on these strategies that risked freezing and kind of cutting off national fonts of creativity in a protectionist mode that would seem more like the Fordist mode that we're saying is past when we look at England or America. Egypt, two cases that Karim and I were talking about, again, this tension between a mass, kind of almost totalitarian national project that's where the main actor in the cultural industry is not the artist, but is kind of a cast member in a national spectacle of national culture that's seen as necessary for creating competitive advantage in the tourism market, then set against another set of policies that want to upgrade different kinds of creative actors, which can be, Islamist, ethical, creative actors that are very different from artists and in the kind of bohemian mode, and might have a much more communitarian-based project. And then just quickly compare New Orleans and Dubai, because I think it was fascinating that those two cities came up. Anne was talking about New Orleans and how we have, again, a city, in this case a city somewhat detached, a former global city, somewhat detached from the national fabric, not necessarily promoting a national identity, not necessarily obviously being able to benefit from national resources, protection, and investment. Basically thinking about reconstituting or reinventing its own population, substituting its old population, developing tourism and global consumer visitors. Anyway, just how contradictory the policy framework in New Orleans is and how different it is from the cities we've been looking at, such as New York and London. And then finally Dubai, another city which has no national referent, it has no nation that it connects to in a sense, promoting these massive new cultural institutions, which in this case don't seem to promote intellectual property or export, but are meant to just simply perhaps raise another level of international investment to secure an even higher level of international confidence and investment. So I guess our point is that in this new dynamic world order in which we're no longer in the Thatcher moment of deindustrialization, we're in a moment of mass populist, semi-peripheral self-assertion of new nations on the geopolitical stage, that creativity has many more experimental forms of self-assertion that are collective, even totalitarian in nature.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Andrew.
Mark, could you just clarify the relationship between the populist and the totalitarian? I was confused.
The returning. Hello. Okay. But several examples of nationalist or governments promoting a competitive image-based, image-driven project of national re-identification, in which there was not investments made in micro-projects for individual creators, but there was a mass project in which some national industries were being protected and protecting certain creative industries, but then in tension with these kind of museumification programs in which populations were being forced into grids in which they have to reproduce a particular creative model. So it's like a Fordist form of creative industry. So, in a sense that it's a totalizing, vertically integrated model of culture, not based upon the individual cultural entrepreneur, but based upon a vertically integrated total model of a cultural industry. So I think there can be well, in the places I study, populism is a right-wing. No, it's not the American, like late 19th century. Anyway.